And our next presentation is Visualization of Counter 5 Data by Bridgett Bonar, who is an acquisitions assistant at Dartmouth College Libraries. She received her MLIS from Simmons University in 2020. Bridgett enjoys bringing user-centric perspectives to acquisition problems and understanding the systems we utilize daily. All right, Bridgett, take it away. I will stop sharing now.
All right, is that coming across okay?
Yep, looks good.
Wonderful. Yeah, so apologize, my notes didn't show up. Sorry. Okay, that's better. Yeah, so many of us are working towards expanding the usage data that we're intaking for our e-resources. And more importantly, what usage data we're communicating outside of, say, our e-resources team. An important part of communicating data is visualizations, which can help trends and outliers stand out. But it's really easy to create visualizations that are difficult to read or confuse information. What I'm going to discuss today is some of the theory about creating clean and readable visualizations using Counter 5 data as instance. While visualizations are also often constrained by the programs we create them with, I certainly was. I'm using Oracle Analytics, which is almost linked analytics function. I'm not going to be discussing how to create these visualizations in that or any program, but I'm going to focus on the thought process behind what visualizations to create in the instances of each type of data. Also, as you can see, this is not a comprehensive list of visualizations by any stretch of the imagination. I'm really only focusing on the most common ones. So the first thing you have to decide when you're designing visualization is what data you're going to use. Counter 5 makes some of these decisions for us because they decide what is counted and how. But they do sometimes count things in multiple ways. And it's essential to know, even if you're limited to only one option, what is going on in your visualization so that you can explain it elsewhere. Yeah, Counter 5 uses these 6 metric types across all of their reports. Since I was creating a dashboard which involved multiple reports and visualizations, I chose to limit all of my visualizations to unique item requests where I could. And if I didn't have that option, I would move to the closest one, unique title request or total item request. And I would make sure that I was telling people and defining whatever options that I was using with each visualization or table that I was showing. The reason I chose to focus on unique item requests is because I was creating these visualizations for internal library use with a focus on renewal of e-resources. So I wanted to get as close as possible to the number of people who were using a resource, rather than, hey, there's one person downloaded this 5 times and that's counted every time and there's no way of knowing. If you were creating a report for some other reason, you might use a different metric as your main focus. If you were, say, justifying a purchase or something. You'll see that total item request is often a lot larger than unique item requests. This is in part because the platforms want you to continue to buy them. So if they say total item request 500, that's going to encourage you to buy them more. That's not to say that that's a bad thing, but it's just something that you should be aware of. And I'm going to take a look at these reports in a slightly different breakdown than I usually see them. The first is based on number of uses. So this is just a simple count of how many things were accessed or not accessed in the case of the denial reports. Whereas some of the other reports make distinctions within the uses, like whether it's gold, OA, or controlled access, or by what year the article was published. And that's going to lead you to a different set of visualizations when you start to look at the data. And of course, you should keep in mind the other data that these reports give you. I ended up using a lot of this because I was creating an interactive dashboard that allowed you to limit by a lot of this. But really in my visualizations, I only use usage state and platform. If you look on the internet for data visualization recommendations, they're going to range from crazy specific to very, very general. But in the most general sense, I think there are two important things to keep in mind whenever you're creating something. It's you need to know what you're saying with this visualization, and it can't be so complex that it's not readable. And so what type of visualization to use for each type of data? Like I said, a pure count of just number of uses, you might want to look at how the usage for this evolves over time. Or you might want to rank, say, the top 10 used material in each format. Whereas for a different type of data, if you're making distinctions within the usage, you'll want to look at a part of a whole graph. And I have some examples here. In addition, if you go to those links below, you'll see some way more in-depth, especially the data to viz sort of flow chart. It's very, very nuanced, unlike my slide here. So I'm going to start with line graphs. Like I said, line graphs display the evolution of a variable over time. They're really easy go-tos because we've all seen a line graph. Everyone's seen a line graph. They know how to read them and what they're supposed to look like. But you can make them insanely confusing. So this was the very first thought I had when I was creating my visualizations, is I wanted to show usage over time for each platform. And I ran into the first problem with creating some of these graphs. It's called a spaghetti chart, where all of your lines look like spaghetti. Basically, it makes it impossible to read because all of these lines overlap, and because I have so many variables here, the colors repeat. So this line at the top, the purple one, is actually Science Direct and not the American Association for Cancer Research or the American Rod and Ray Society, like might be suggested by this part of the legend. One way to fix this would be to limit it to the top couple of platforms, but since line graphs really get confusing at more than 4 lines, I would suggest maybe a different type of graph if you were doing that. So what I ended up doing instead was looking at the data, breaking down the data by usage year, so we could see the growth over time across years for our usage data. And while some of these lines overlap a little bit, because they follow a general flow every year, and because they do sort of increase every year as well, you can tell that it's a lot easier to read than the last example that I gave you. And this really highlights why I thought this graph was important too, because if you look at that above the 5 there, that's May. Of course, we can sit here and say, of course, usage goes up in May. We knew that already. But we didn't necessarily know that it goes up 20,000 hits in just May. So we might say, hey, look at this. We need more staff on our reference sets in May because everybody's looking for stuff then. Or, hey, when we do instruction, is there a way that we can try to get people to start looking for research earlier so that in April, when it dips down, we can sort of even that out so we have the resources to help people when they're looking for stuff. Where this type of graph works a little bit less is at a more granular level. This is the same graph, but it's limited to one title. And as you can see, a single title doesn't usually follow that same path as the aggregate data. And where there's no usage for the year, the line just, for the month, the line just breaks off, which makes it harder to follow. What I ended up doing one of the ways to make this simpler would be to just show 1 year of data, but because I was focusing on renewals, 1 year of data is not enough to make a decision. So what I ended up doing was creating a bar plot with this data instead. So instead of showing the data over time, bar plots show data in a category. And in this case, the category I chose was year. So it is still on some level an evolution chart, just a little bit different. And because it's not as granular, it doesn't have those weird gaps in the lines. And you can still see sort of the overall trend. You can actually see better the overall trend in usage for this title in this format. You could also do a chart like this. This title, as you'll see later, is actually on 3 separate platforms. So instead of by year, you could break it down by platform. But again, at a higher level, that would get really, really hard to read very quickly. So like I said, another sort of chart that I created for this was a top 10 chart. And this is another function of the bar plot, but it's a ranking function. So what's nice about bar plots is the general recommendation for how many categories you have is about 10, which is a lot higher than the 4 that I said for the line charts earlier. So you're able to show more distinctions in a less granular sense. You'll notice that I switched this from the vertical to the horizontal lines as well. That's because these multimedia titles are so long, it would be impossible to read if they were vertical bar charts. In addition, to make the data clearer, when using a bar chart, you should rank them by number of uses. You saw in the last one, it was alphabetical by title, but number of uses really makes it clear that titles with very similar amounts of usage, like if you look in the middle there, my B and Rose and Bending the Arc. If we go back to the last slide, it's really hard to tell that they have, which one of them has more data. But here, because it's ranked, it's really easy to see that my B and Rose is just a little bit higher. I bring this up because you're probably going to have to tell your program to do this instead of just displaying them in input order, which is why mine was defaulted to alphabetic by title. This is another example of the top 10 charts I created, but in this case, the bars are colored by what platform they were on. This is not necessarily recommended because it does add a layer of complexity that makes it a little bit hard to read. And for some reason, my program really shrinks the bin size when you do this. And I haven't figured out how to fix it yet. But I really liked being able to see that 4 of our top 10 used books were on the ProQuest eBook Central platform. And I think that might help in the future when we're ordering books. If we go, hey, it seems like people really like eBook Central as a platform. If we have an option, maybe we should default to that one. And unlike the example at the beginning, the limited number of titles here, and therefore the limited number of platforms that they're on, means that each color here is representing a single platform, so that duplications actually mean something rather than just I ran out of colors in my program. Like my last example, it's possible to add another variable to a bar chart with the addition of color. This most often results in what's called a stacked bar chart, which is the only reason that didn't happen with my last example is because the top 10 function that I was used didn't include data for the same title on different platforms, so there was nothing to stack. So as you can see, the individual categories, secondary categories here can become unreadable really quickly. You can still see that the overall ebook usage is growing every year, but it's really hard to tell if that large blue section, which again is Science Direct, is growing simply because it's being pushed up by the platform beneath it, or if it's actually increasing in number. And many of the smaller platforms that we have are simply invisible on this chart. But I maintain the use of this on my dashboard for the same reason that I provided a bar chart alternative to the yearly usage data, and it's really, really more helpful on the micro level. So this, again, is that same graph limited to one title. And looking at this, it might be easy to say, hey, if most of our usage for this title is on JSTOR anyway, why are we bothering to pay for it when that money could go to something that we don't have access to elsewhere, that's not being used more elsewhere? Or since we just went through a project where we reordered our links, the links in our catalog, placing the publisher links on top of the aggregators like JSTOR instead of using an alphabetic list, I can use this graph really clearly to show, hey, that worked. A lot more people are going to the University of California Press for this title now than they were when it was the last one on the list. So this is the first part of a whole option that I'm showing you. And this, like I said before, relies on putting the data into categories. In this case, usage year and platform. Whereas the stacked area graph shows proportions through distribution. So it's the same sort of have a bar graph and stack it, except this is have a line graph in a way and stack it. I'm going to switch to using the TRJ3 report for this one because it's the cleanest example of part of a whole data. There's just too many distinctions in the TRJ4 for it to look nice in aggregate. But one of the problems with visualizing access types is that the counter data is not the whole picture. This report will not include any accesses on fully OA platforms, since they, as a rule, don't provide us with counter data information. And counter 5 3 reports, that's the TRB3 and the TRJ3, don't distinguish between delayed, green, or other transformative OA and fully controlled access. So this is a very minimalistic picture of our OA usage. Stacked area charts can be difficult in some ways because the top total or upper line is dependent on the lower line. So if the lower usage goes way up and the upper usage stays the same, the line is going to go way up even at the top. So it can be hard to read the exact value of the upper section. This one is pretty easy because our OA usage on controlled platforms is relatively consistent. And you will also notice that I can't show in one graph multiple years because I'm using that color distinction already to show the difference between the gold OA and the controlled access. But knowing this proportion that it can be helpful maybe at the title level, where you can say, hey, most of our usage for this journal is on their OA articles, or something along that line. Perhaps a more helpful version is the percentage version. So this looks very similar to the last version I showed you because, like I said, our OA usage is pretty consistent at 20% or 30,000 usage over the course of this year. If you were to look at the 2021 data, it actually drops down percentage-wise. But yeah, so some of this data is less overarching. But it's still good to know that we're using so much OA in our controlled platforms. So another really important piece of visualizations is the description. Whoever your audience is, and I've stolen this maxim from coding, but even if it's just future you, even if only I was ever going to look at this dashboard, I would know less about counter data when I went back to look at it than when I created it. And that's especially true for the purpose of the visualization. In addition, you really want to make sure that your viewer has the context to understand the data that you're showing them. I've been providing a lot of this context verbally to you, but it's even more important when you're presenting something that's meant to stand alone, like a dashboard or a report. Doing this without leading your viewer to the conclusion that you want them to make can be tricky, but I find it's easiest if you explain what the data is rather than the graph itself. This was really easy for me since I was using that interactive workspace. I couldn't describe the chart anywhere because it was going to change depending on who was looking at it and what limiters they were using. So if you consider this chart, it has the description on what it is. It's the top 10 ebooks that were used in 2022. But there's other information I would want to provide to anyone seeing. And while some of this description may feel obvious, like that the colors represent different platforms, knowing that the usage for the same title on different platforms would not be included in this data is vital to understanding this information. And in addition, I've defined what Counter's definition of book and unique title requests further up the page. So it is there for people to read it. And in addition, I really encourage you to provide the raw data right next to your visualization. A lot of my previous talk about providing multiple visualizations has been because I need to make sure this dashboard works at a multitude of levels because it was an interactive report, like I said. So regardless of whether the report you're creating is interactive or static, where you can limit the visualizations to the one that work at the data level you're discussing, having the raw data besides your visualization is a good way to provide additional information that would clutter your visualizations. Say you hated that I colored these bars, I could still show the platforms on these on the corresponding table. And although my program allows you to roll over those bars, I can do it here because this is just a screenshot, and see the numerical information, being able to tell that Latin American cinema is, 6, I can't do that math right now, so I'm just guessing, 6 more usage than designing clinical research, rather just knowing that they're about the same, was really important for me to be able to show. And lastly, some people don't like visualization. I don't know any of those people, but I'm sure they exist. And I wanted this to be able to, I wanted people to be able to export this data and share it outside of the library community if that's what they wanted to do as well. So here are some references that I have. I really recommend, if you're getting very deep into visualizations, I recommend from Data to Viz. Like I said, it's very granular. But the towards data science, the Metwali Sarah, she actually has a group of articles. I think that would be really helpful if you're just getting into visualizations, and then some counter definition stuff. Here's a couple of more articles that I found helpful reading, but the information in them just didn't make it into this presentation. So, does anyone have any questions?
Okay, we do have some questions in the Q&A. Thank you, by the way, for that presentation. That was really cool. When I make visualizations, I always wonder what's the best way to present this. And I think you really covered all the bases. So thanks. Our first question is, did you ever consider calculating the cost per usage for journals in order to justify keeping subscriptions? You divide the annual number of downloads into the subscription cost.
Yeah. So this is a function. The reason I didn't show this right now is the function of Alma Analytics. You have to combine multiple reports to do that, which necessitates matching titles across different reports. Yeah, it's something that we've been thinking about as I was creating this. I was like, oh, that would be really great. And there are some people out there, I can't remember which institution it was, but the the most recent ENO conference had a presentation where they created a dashboard like this and a cost per use. So there are definitely people who are doing that. I just didn't have the time to sort of make that function in a way that would allow me to visualize it.
Yeah, I can vouch for the challenge of cost per use in Alma. Our next question is, what is your process for extracting and loading data?
So all of this data is loaded automatically into my program via a sushi link from the platform. It gets loaded into our instance of Alma and then gets exported out into analytics. So I don't have to do any of that. It just sort of exists.
Great. Next question, what tools do you use for your visualizations?
Yeah, so for this, I was using Alma Oracle Analytics because I wanted this to sort of exist in Alma so that everyone in my institution can see it. And that way I didn't have to worry about being the one who was restricting access. I could just say, hey, everyone with access to our system can see this. But if you're not using Alma, or if you're not, I don't know if Oracle Analytics is an add-on. There are a lot of programs that will help you with this. Personally, I like R, which is, I like to call it Excel on steroids, but you can certainly use Excel or Google Sheets as well.
Okay. Our next question is, top 10 ebook format / paired charts is excellent. Did you create that layout, or was it requested by admin / collections person, or is that you too?
I created that layout because I wanted to separate all the reports into different pages. So I had this initial page that was just like, here's some information and the definition of journals and counter reports. So I needed something to put there. And I was like, you know what would be cool? What's the top 10 books that we've used? So it wasn't really as thought out as it might have been.
Okay. I think you already answered the question of what program do you use to create your visualizations. So I'll go to the next one. Great talk, thanks. Do you know of other publications / resources / presentations about visualizing counter data? I'm working with students to develop an FOS app, sorry, I don't know the acronym, for visualizing counter data, and we want to get as much background as possible.
Yeah, like I said, when I attended this last fall, there were several presentations about using Alma Analytics to create dashboards like this. So I'm sure there's other stuff, but I just don't know it.
Okay. Let's see. Oh, and someone just let me know, and I'll let everyone else know, FOS is free open source. Thank you. How do you manage platforms that aren't sushi compliant?
So I don't. I didn't mention this, but like way up on all my pages, I say, hey, so this is only data for sushi accessible counter compliant platforms. If you have a weird little platform that you're looking at, it's not here. Sorry. It's just, once again, it's just not something that I had time for when I was creating this. And because so many of our big platforms are counter compliant and sushi accessible, it wasn't really a concern that I had when I was creating. But you're right, in the future, I would like to expand to things that don't have data.
Yeah, and that's kind of related to the next question, was how do you report usage that is not included in Alma? So let's see the next one. Were there other options besides color to make designations like platform when looking at ebook titles? I know color alone might be enough for that designation, e.g. colorblind individuals.
Yes. I should have considered more sorry, I'm blanking, accessible solutions. I don't know that my program had other options for making that distinction besides keeping that information in the table.
Okay, well, that is the end of our questions, and it's right in time for a quick 10-minute break that we're going to take. So I just want to thank you one more time, Bridgett, for presenting that. That was really fantastic. There's a lot of chatter in the chat about your presentation and related concepts. So thanks again.